Good day to everyone who has joined from all over the world. On behalf of the World Council of Churches management team, I welcome you to the second session of the Theological Reflection on Hate Speech and Whiteness. The title of this session is Legacy of Slavery, Structural Racism, and Religion. I will not repeat the background of these webinars, but just to say that the WCC has been interested in the topic of racism for a very long time. And now we are moving towards another programmatic work in the area of overcoming racism. And this theological reflection is part of that contribution. So we have a series of webinars. We started yesterday. Today we have one, and then another one tomorrow and Thursday, and we finish on Friday. For all the webinars, our objectives are: one, to confirm that hate speech and whiteness are two overarching issues for the broader global manifestation of racism today. And the second one is to strengthen the ecumenical theological reflection, accompaniment, and advocacy in the area of racial justice. And the third one is to underline the importance of applying a framework of intersectionality in ongoing WCC programmatic work on overcoming racism. Just like yesterday, today's webinars will be moderated by Reverend Dr. Fernando Enz, who is a member of the WCC Central Committee and one of the moderators of the reference group on a reference group on pilgrimage of justice and peace, and the reference group on theological study group. And he is also a professor of theology in the Faculty of Religion and Theology at the Free University in Amsterdam. And then before we continue, or before we actually start the presentation, let's focus on a short prayer. We gather in the name of the triune God, Creator, Redeemer, Sustainer, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, to whom we bring our prayers. Our Lord Jesus Christ, you said, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God." We come to you, God, as the seekers of peace with justice, as we reflect on the challenges of racism all over the world. We thank you, God, because any form of racism is a sin before you. We pray that you amplify our voices to challenge racism wherever it manifests itself. We commit ourselves to you, God, to be used as instruments of peace with justice in the whole world. We pray to commit our gathering into your hands. Bless us with theological insights so that together we can articulate and contribute to overcoming racism and affirm all human beings as reflecting the image of God and worthy to be treated with dignity. We pray in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. Amen. I now hand over to Fernando.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Isabel Firi, also professor, colleague, Deputy General Secretary of the World Council of Churches. Thank you for opening this session on the series of our webinars. It is wonderful to see many of you gathering again here, and a warm welcome also to an audience that is the ecumenical fellowship worldwide, but also beyond even the ecumenical fellowship. It is an opportunity to meet together, to sit together, to discern together the very urgent topic of racism, more specifically, hate speech and whiteness. So welcome to this second session that we are having today, this afternoon, or the morning, or the evening, wherever you're sitting. Let me quickly explain to you why this topic and what is this topic doing in this programmatic framework of the Pilgrimage of Justice and Peace. The program called A Pilgrimage of Justice and Peace has been initiated by the World Council of Churches Assembly 2013 in Busan in Korea. And since then, the Ecumenical Fellowship is on a pilgrimage of justice and peace. Now, the General Secretary has called together a reference group, an international reference group composed of different people, different backgrounds, different denominations, different cultures, and also a theological study group to help to give shape to this program, Pilgrimage of Justice and Peace. Now, what we have done, and I have the privilege to moderate that group together with my colleague Jennifer Martin, you will meet her later today. We have decided that a pilgrimage should not only inform us about the content, justice and peace, but it should also inform us about a methodology. So what we have done in the past years is traveling really as a reference group and a theological study group to different places, putting our bodies into different spaces, meeting communities, churches, fellowships, congregations, people of all kinds, to listen, first of all. We have experienced a great hospitality by all these local groups, local communities, and we decided to visit them as pilgrims, to enjoy, of course, their hospitality, but also to sit with them and listen, sometimes sharing their tears, sometimes celebrating the joys with them, sometimes trying to discern how to transform the injustices. And all of that, that wisdom that we gathered around the globe from these communities has helped us to give shape to a pilgrimage that we invite all of you to participate in, of course. And we see many initiatives around the globe to the churches and communities who take up this approach. Now, during our visits, we have picked up different themes, of course, as you can imagine. Every context has its own challenges and their own forms of violence, their own forms of injustices. But what we realized after a while was that there are 4 themes that are really sticking out and that seem to be a topic and a challenge to all of these contexts. So something that we all have in common and that we should face together, and we should discern together what to do about these topics. Now, these 4 themes, I will quickly tell them to you. Number 1 is truth and trauma. I will not say more about that because this is not the topic of today, truth and trauma. The second one was land and displacement. That wasn't the second topic that we discovered is present in all these contexts. Number 3, the third topic was gender justice. Again, in all the contexts, wherever you go, you find injustices. And number 4, and this is what we are discussing today also, was the whole issue of racism. Again, this is not a topic that is reduced to one or the other context. This is a phenomenon that we discovered is a challenge and something that is present in all the societies we live in. So this is 19 about the topic of racism and racial injustices. And we then discovered that we need to talk more about whiteness and about hate speech. The presenters of today will tell you more about that, and you will very soon discover why these are the topics that are so urgent for today. So that is a bit of the background. I welcome the speakers of today and also some other members. The people that you will see today are either members of the Theological Study Group on the Pilgrimage of Justice and Peace, or they were part already of the Tokyo consultation last year. So these are experts in the field of racism, the studying of this phenomenon from different disciplines, backgrounds, context, and so on. And it is really wonderful to see all that wisdom and knowledge being gathered here in this room. Of course, we have a worldwide audience following us. Feel free to use the chat rooms either here in the Zoom session, or you can also use the chat room in the YouTube channel if you follow us on YouTube. All right. We will try to, we will have papers, presentations, and then each one will receive a response. And we will have hopefully enough time also to discuss the topics. And this is where we can bring in some of your questions, either here from this room or from the International Fellowship. Okay, so welcome again. I look forward to this session and our first speaker. Let me introduce our first speaker. It is a good friend and a great scholar, Reverend Dr. Iva Caruthers. She's a founding trustee and general secretary of the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Conference. That is an interdenominational organization within the African American faith tradition that focuses on social justice issues. Iva is Professor Emeritus and former chairperson of the Sociology Department at the Northeastern Illinois University in the United States of America. And she's a member of the United Church of Christ. Iva, over to you. Thanks for being with us. I look forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Reverend Dr. Isabel. It is always such a pleasure to be welcomed into the space of the World Council of Churches. And I look forward to the conversation that will be moderated by Fernando. I certainly welcome this opportunity to look upon all of my friends that have gathered and colleagues here. And I am just delighted that we have been called back together around this important conversation. I will say up front that I am not an expert on whiteness. However, I do claim to be an authority around the consequences of whiteness. And it is in that context then that I want to share with you what I consider to be some observations from the bridge of witnessing, experiencing both the social, political, economic consequences, spiritual and emotional trauma, the collateral damage and the existential reality that we still confront in terms of whiteness. In this call around hate speech and whiteness, I subtitled my reflection as a dangerous tributary to genocide. And so we know we can't do this kind of conversation in the short time that we have, but I will certainly do what I can to contribute to expand our exploration of it. Let me begin by saying we have all been influenced, I think, by the significant corpus of legacy of W.E.B. Du Bois. And of course, he left us a notion that the 20th century reality would be defined by the color line. When Du Bois mentioned and elevated that notion, he was talking about the phenotype of the color line, how we looked, because that is what the science focused on and knew. But we have moved to another context, and that's the context that I began to enter into tracking the Human Genome Project. And we have come to a period now where Du Bois' notion of phenotype of the color line must be replaced with the notion of genomic type and the color line. And that becomes really, really critical point of departure as we think about the current impact of COVID-19 on the world. I want to bring into the conversation one of my colleagues and mentors and friends who is an ancestor, the Reverend Dr. Katie Cannon, theologian. And she said, even when people call your truth a lie, you must tell it anyway. I want to lift up in that context then Luke 12:56, which reminds us of the call, a challenge of being hypocrites. You know how to interpret the appearance of earth and sky, but why do you not know how to interpret the present time? My basic thesis is that in the wake of 400 years of what appears as a dehumanized white hegemonic culture that has been, cannot shed its worldview and identity of whiteness, that people of African descent in particular, and people of color more generally, do not belong as equals in community is a value. It appears that the United States at this moment has come to an inflection point of reckoning with its past. The US, I am arguing, is in an identity crisis like it has never experienced before. And in the midst of demographic shifts, America's identity of whiteness is dying, and the death rattle is felt all around the world. Centers of economic, religious, and cultural power are shifting, to say the least. The death of whiteness, grounded in ontological and theological beliefs in an ordained exceptionalism, propped up by a myth of white supremacy that was incentivized by a doctrine of discovery, is apparent. Whiteness is a movement, and as a movement, is at war with itself and a God that it feels has abandoned it. We know whiteness and identity crises in sociological and psychological terms, but as people of faith, we know that crisis also means kairos. And so it is most transcendent that we have this conversation with the lens of faith. And that is what gives me hope. And I hope that is what gives all those who are within the sounds of our voices hope. I do want to say, however, that the bell is being rung by some people we need to listen to and understand their point of view. Former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright has warned America about the rising fascism and fascist policies, and she has even named the current president for his disdain for democratic institutions, the ideals of equality and social justice, civil discourse, civic virtues, and America itself. And that's a quote. We have experts like James Waller of Genocide, who warns us that the trajectory of genocide can occur very quietly. It can occur with those people who are right around us, who are just, quote, normal rank and file people. So it is in the context of understanding that world, global, ecumenical tables, NGO tables become important as we think about the embracing of a North Star that we call peace and justice. African Americans, people from the United States, have not used these tables. And there have been claims of genocide from people of the United States of African American descent since the inception of the United Nations. There were at least 3 very specific times in which collaboratives went to the UN to claim genocide. But in the age of COVID-19, this global pandemic, the witnessing of its desperate consequences and toll upon people of African descent, we see the emergence of a presidency of a president who uses hate speech and coded language and drama and television with intentionality of mishandling a national public health policy with international consequences. And that has to inform our situational analysis and a hermeneutic of suspicion around genocide. Fast forward, bottom line is that where in the United States, Black people represent about 13% of the population. There are some locations in which Black people represent 72% of the deaths from COVID-19. So this desperate impact is but an extension of the 400 years of trajectory of this white hegemonic justification using white speech and hate speech towards developing this hierarchy. Specifically, in the context of COVID-19, we now seem to have coming to revelation this embrace of a herd mentality as a way to mitigate the pandemic itself. Just let them all die, and eventually there will be enough through herd mentality there will be enough resistance in the community that is left. I would say that in at least 30 years ago, the scientific community understood, the epidemiologists understood that new diseases would come forth. We remember some of how that was played out in terms of HIV/AIDS and even Ebola more recently. And there were very clear directives and understandings that public health officials nationally and internationally set forth as protocols that one would adopt if one came into that situation, much of which is being ignored in this country and then being justified by hate speech and what I would call this rationalization of a hierarchy of human value. That is a triage model, that some people are more valuable, worth more than others, and therefore should stand in line at the head of the line in terms of salvation. But we also, in our American context, remember the US Health Department's Tuskegee experiment around syphilis. And so the current director of the Tuskegee National Bioethics Center has said the question is not, as this unfolds, can Black America trust, or who does Black America trust? It is more importantly about trustworthiness, not just about trust, but trustworthiness. And so Reverend Dr. Reuben Warren cautions us as an epidemiologist and as a person of faith that as we embrace these new methods and these calls for trials and vaccinations, et cetera, we have to put trustworthiness at the center of those decisions. I then go on in the paper to suggest that not only have our communities gone to the UN around the International Convention around Genocide, but also begun to think about the international conventions around the use of human genetic data. Because in the midst of this COVID-19, in the midst of this genomic violence, we also have to experience this dual pandemic that you all around the world have seen evidence of police state violence against people of African descent. And so this dual pandemic, in fact, it's a triple pandemic because, as you know, we're 2 weeks away from election, the most probably significant official in the world in terms of the democracy in this country. And we are experiencing extreme voter suppression and extreme evidence of trying to prevent what is a clear identity crisis. And as a result of that, Blacks have also gone to the UN calling for observers, election observers. Just I want to footnote that because this election is so much at risk. But it would be a total misread of history despite this election if we want to reduce this to Trumpism only. What I want to suggest and what I have suggested is that this represents 50 years of the coming together of a culmination. And despite how some of us, many of us people of faith, may find disdainful and incredible what is happening, Trump has been able to sustain over a 40% base of support with all kinds of rationales and justifications for that. What we need to take away, I believe, in this conversation is that the demographic shift in America, the browning of America, in 2012, where more children were born of people of color than white children, now has a situation in which 43% of millennials are now non-white. And so for an elected official who is attempting to run, one of the senators to kind of forget that the opponent in the vice presidency race, her name is Kamala, he kept referring to her as Tamala, eventually trying to get you to see he was really saying tamale, which would bring forth the notion of the Mexicans who are coming is the kinds of ways in which we cannot ignore how language and coded language impacts and is internalized in this epigenetic period. And so We are blessed and we can carry and pick up this mantle of hope because of the World Council of Churches, who has had the audacity to say, we affirm the evidence of global Afrophobia, for example, and we must dig deeper into the implications of an Afrophobia and its relationship to language and hate speech, so that when we begin to see African nations being called, quote, shithole nations from the center of American democracy, when Muslim people are being banned, et cetera, so we can go down the list. We understand what we're up against. So let me bring this to a close by saying, what is our call? What is our goal? I'm suggesting that in this genomic age of COVID-19 pandemic, the question becomes, how do we ensure that the culture of Ubuntu, a paradigm, and not a hierarchy of human value paradigm based on whiteness, is the value that we espouse, the value that we create a new world order. A view from the bridge that I stand on pretends that the intersection of racism and national populism and immigration is real and cannot be ignored. So I would like to offer a heuristic paradigm shift of conversation that begins not with the affirmation of I am a man or ain't I a woman or Black Lives Matter, but I think we need to start asking a deeper question. Where is the humanity of those who can continue to perpetuate the kinds of systems that are being created that we're talking about? Why are you who epitomize hate speech and violence so afraid of violence? How does patriotism become a cover for evil? And why can't you make space for self-interrogation? Why can't you come to apology? Just an apology for the generational centuries of the consequences of a transatlantic slave trade. I want to share with you and end by a quote from a young millennial who I am blessed to be in relationship with. And he left us these words in a piece that he wrote one morning before he prayed. He said, to be Black in America is to know violence. To be brown in America is to know death. To be a Negro in America is to know propaganda and the illusion of what has never been. And then he asks the question, is it possible or plausible to say that peace in this nation state won't occur until the sword is rightly applied and its blade readily sharpened by all who decry justice in the name of freedom? A freedom not of exclusivity, but one of divine inclusivity, where all of God's children abide, attain, experience, and rest in life and death within the Holy Spirit's fullness. Those words by Reverend Jamar Boyd give me hope, because we have a young generation behind us who has taken up the mantle to continue this conversation. And so I leave us where I began with Luke 56, 12:56. Do you not know, do we not know how to interpret the present time? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Iva, for this powerful message. It is breathtaking how you put this together and how you lead us into today's discussions. Thanks so much for all that wisdom. I'm going to invite Tiniku Maluleke now to respond. Professor Tiniku Maluleke, he's a senior research fellow and deputy director of the University of Pretoria Center for the Advancement of Scholarship in South Africa. He's a theologian by training and a leading and internationally recognized researcher, specializing in religion and politics, as well as Black and African theologies. And Tiniku has been a friend and a companion on this ecumenical journey for a long time. He has helped the World Council of Churches in many regards. Welcome, Tiniku. We look forward to your response to Iva. You have to unmute Tiniku, please.
Let's unmute. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak. I have given my response the title, The Bridges Between the Phases and the Faces. In the paper that Professor Carruthers has just given us, she makes several key and related arguments. She notes, for example, that while Du Bois was prophetic in naming the color line as the main challenge of the 20th century, he was incorrect to imply that the problem might be confined only to that century. Indeed, the problem persists, albeit, and she makes it very clear, in newer guises and permutations. Today, racism shows up as Afrophobia, as xenophobia, as colorism, as gender discrimination, as classism, as the digital divide, the rural versus the urban, north versus south, and of course, in the whole area of the fourth industrial revolution and the genome revolution to which he was referring. By the very existence, their very existence, these evolving faces and phases of racism demonstrated just how sophisticated and how systematic and institutional become. Now, whatever else whiteness is, it is more than words, and it can't be just a set of philosophical ideas. It is material, it is institutional, it is consequential, and it is rooted in law, in custom, and in policy. Given that whiteness has existed as the norm for a long time, it sometimes suffers from the disease of taking its own myths not only for granted, but too seriously. This is how the power of whiteness becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. The situation which James Baldwin described in his famous speech in 1965 at Cambridge University, when he said, when you walk out of Harlem and you see that things are better outside Harlem, then everything you've been told about who you are sounds true. But that truth, I want to argue, is also true on the other side. So if you don't live in Harlem and you live in Manhattan or in Sandton in Johannesburg, you look outside and you think, yes, it is correct that I am a superior human being. Similarly, someone who lives in New York's leafy suburbs is likely to think that they deserve to be there and it is only correct and right that they are there. Now, is whiteness in crisis? In the Carruthers paper and draft that I have read and I've listened to her just now, it is suggested that whiteness as a movement is at war with itself, and that the movement might even feel abandoned by God at this time. She argues that the USA is in an identity crisis than never before. Now, not living in the USA, I'm not able to gauge that. But I do want to suggest that the notion of crisis should always be handled with care and caution. Not every disaster, not every calamity, not every fiasco necessarily signals a deep and fruitful crisis. Like all hegemonies, whiteness seldom sits calm and easy at the helm. Such is the brutality, the provocation, and totalitarian ambitions of whiteness, that it will necessarily give rise to waves of counter-hegemonic movement. No hegemonic system is ever in control so totally that there will be an absolute absence of resistance and built-in contradiction. In their survey of meanings of whiteness in South Africa, two scholars, Ratele and Lobsha, argue that whiteness is rife with contradictions, ambiguities, paradoxes, and the untenability of its artifice. Indeed, I want to suggest that hegemonies tend to trigger, require, and need to generate little crises, large and small, all the time. So, for example, the crisis of apartheid has been how long? You could argue that it started in 1940, but only in 1994 did we see some sign of apartheid coming to an end. So I want to suggest that if there is a crisis in the US, it's a long, long walk to freedom. And that we need to take, I think, in our struggle against whiteness, the long view, so that the crisis of which Carassa writes could only be the beginning of a process that will last for the next 100 years, assuming that and ourselves, and we don't exist in that time. As a system, whiteness is not simply a matter of whites versus blacks. It talks to a poisoned system that infects structures, processes, and people in a myriad of ways. The American system of whiteness does not seem like it is about to crumble from where I stand, with or without Trump. She also refers to the will to genocide, and I'm going to skip some sections so that I stop in 1 or 2 minutes. I couldn't agree more with Carassa's cautions about the linkages between whiteness, hate speech, and the will to genocide. By the turn of the 19th century, Africa had faced several attempted genocides of its people. These occurred in the context of the slave buying and the catching and the taming and the transportation of slaves by both European and Arabian slave dealers. It also occurred in Namibia, where there was an attempt to wipe out the Herero and the Nama at the turn of the century. And of course, in 1994, as South Africa celebrated its freedom, Rwanda was in another genocide. So it seems to me that we have made 3 steps forward, but have taken 4 steps backward as far as racism, whiteness are concerned. So we have seen new strains of social Darwinism coming up all over the world. Perhaps what we have to contend with is whether whiteness itself is not essentially a system of genocide, with hate speech providing inspiration and rationalization for the killings. And the killings can happen fast or slow. They can happen over time, or they can happen quickly. I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Maluleke. Tiniko, for your response. Iva, you have the first opportunity to again respond to Tiniko if you want, but we can also invite the others to contribute as well. But I want to give you the opportunity to react to what Tiniko has said.
I think I really appreciate his response, Tiniko. I read your response, and it was it made me think even more deeply about the move into a new stadium or space where the game of whiteness is played. And I think I want to make sure we don't minimize the qualitative nature of a eugenics-based game of whiteness versus grounded in a phenotype. You know, my suspicion of because you look different, you are different, than a genomic-based game of racism because of genetic science and what is being learned about that. And that is, for me, I think, a significant turning point that reinforces the reality that obviously the prayers at the top of the ship were not the same prayers at the bottom of the ship. And 400 years is just enough. I mean, to imagine another 100 years is unfathomable, even though we do have the long view. But let's be clear, we've already experienced the 400 years, right? And so in this moment of Black Lives Matter, I think that we have a special obligation of people of faith to really understand the consequences. And it is interesting and perhaps prophetic that part of the realization for me of the importance of the Human Genome Project was because there was a conference held in South Africa during the apartheid period, in which the conversation that sociologists and epidemiologists and scientists were having said something about European hegemony being potentially threatened by what they called, quote, genetic predisposition. That happened, a conversation in South Africa. And so who has control over the scientific knowledge, the capacity to create knowledge, and to have policies that will dictate how human beings are triaged is very, very critical. And I just want to make sure that as we entertain this, we are clear about the difference between conversations of race analysis in the context of phenotype versus genotype.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Iva. I think this is a very difficult question, what I see you debating. And I welcome some others. If you want to join the discussion, feel free to raise your hand here. But I mean, are we in a moment where the situation is really turning? And as much as I want to follow you, Iva, in when you say, and I follow Tiniko's words here, basically, that whiteness is in crisis and it even feels abandoned by God. I am not so sure. And when you say, Iva, well, we have it 400 years is enough. Well, you could have said that after 200 years, right? I mean, 200 years was enough. You could have said that after 10 years. 10 years is enough. We've seen it. This is inhumane. This is a sin. And yet we see this whiteness continuing. And I am not so sure that this whiteness is ready or at a point where enough white people are willing to give up the privileges that they still enjoy. And when I talk about privileges, I want to point out especially the economic privileges, because it seems to me that it is since the economy is so much tied into this racist worldview and depends on the exploitation of the other, that I have my doubts. I see more. I mean, trying to play the devil's advocate here, I see a lot of polarization in the societies and the willingness to defend whatever the costs are, this white supremacy.
I would agree. And let me just add one thing. What I'm trying to suggest is not that this whiteness will not fight to the end. I am suggesting that the crisis is driven by the demographic shift. The whiteness in the old system had the benefit of being in their minds the majority. They have now come to reality and have to grapple with what it means to be an other or a minority. In the words of demographer Wattenberg, we have to figure out in terms of our reduced biological, and he uses those words, a biological fertility and growth. We have to figure out how we will maintain white hegemony. He calls it Western cultural hegemony, and at the same time be a minority. where these people of color have now come to a new sense of identity themselves and a sense of power in a neo-colonial world. How do we have to restructure the world order in a way that allows us, despite the fact that we are clearly a minority, quantitatively maintain hegemony in terms of cultural dominance? And that's what I mean is the crisis. And that's what is driving, I think, the kind of up against the wall craziness that includes the kind of hate speech that we hear from the Oval Office even.
Right. Well, that is, thank you. Thank you very much. That is, I find that very helpful to get your point on this, where you see that that crisis and that possibility of change also. Right. Any other comments? Tiniko, go ahead.
Yeah, yes. So I think that one of the discussions we are having is about the nature of hegemony. And the contestation around hegemony, because hegemony invites contestation. In fact, hegemony needs contestation because that's how it remains intelligent in terms of planning ahead and knowing what is really going on. So I think we need to really think hard about the nature of hegemony, because hegemony does not require majority. Certainly that is the story of racism in South Africa. 350 years of racism in South Africa did not require white people to be in the majority. Almost another 400 years, if you like, of white power without being numerically hegemonic at all, but very, very hegemonic in other ways. And so I am convinced that the demographic shift will make a difference. I just don't know whether it necessarily will make a difference against whiteness. I mean, Brazil has had that demographic shift, I believe, or at least would like to believe that it has had it, insofar as Brazil keeps preaching the gospel of racial democracy, where color is no longer white or black, even though if you scratch the surface, you will see it. So I'm just saying, let of a hegemonic system and be very, very cautious as we sharpen our weapons, our analytical weapons, but also our weapons of resistance, using every biblical and theological weapon that we can fashion. But majority, I have been in the majority in this country for the longest time, but I haven't been in power. Well, except as a man, because there is some power that goes with the gender of being a man. Okay.
Thank you, Tiniko. Your last sentence is actually also pointing to something that we have been discussing and we will continue to discuss, and that is the intersectionality of the issues that we tackle with here. Thanks a lot. I will turn to Peter Crutchley. Go ahead, Peter.
Can you hear me? Just to add my deep thanks to Iva and to Tiniko. I think this naming of whiteness is powerful, and I'm still processing it, as you can imagine. This comment on the whiteness that is dying, undergirded by this sense of God, this kind of vision that's rooted in this kind of Christian articulation of whiteness is something obviously I've been working on, and as a mission organization I want to touch on, and just to reflect back that actually as I look at the places in now that I've moved to the UK, that really the decline that churches have experienced in the West is about white people not going to church anymore. And this kind of resonates with this whole kind of vision of this vision of whiteness is dying. But raises the question then, why do churches want to grow again? And what is actually underpinning the urge by declining churches to grow amongst white people again, to bring white people back? That actually all of the discussion that takes place in this kind of context about decline doesn't notice that Black people have continued to be faithful and engaged in faith, but white people are the ones who have left. And actually we have to explore and scrutinize our urges then again, as we've been trying to do with the mission materials in LMS. What are the mission urges that are being revealed here about white power? So I'm curious how that's seen outside, but certainly how other perhaps colleagues and friends in the European context might see that as a dimension of decline and the desire to grow again. But thank you.
Thanks a lot, Peter. Isabel Firi.
Thank you very much for the two presentations, which are stimulating a lot of conversation. I see a tension here, a tension between living in hope despite what is the current reality and naming the reality to influence the future. As a student of biblical studies and history, we see that things do change, even when we least expect them to do. Because I'm thinking of the Exodus story, that, when Moses came on the scene and trying to change the mind of Pharaoh, it looked like an impossible situation. And a day came and things changed. And we see that model, manifesting itself over and over in situations of oppression, right? Where you think, with your human eyes, you think it can't change. But then we see the fall of the Berlin Wall. And when I first went to South Africa, I was so sure that, things are not going to change during our lifetime. It didn't even take 10 years after I went there to see the fall of apartheid. So here I want to stand with Eva that, I want to look at the American situation as something that is showing us that white supremacy is unchangeable, but that too can fall. And we are people of faith. And I think we need to use this faith, to think positively and hope and act towards the fall of whiteness and the uplifting of every human being's dignity.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this message of hope, your prophetic voices, Iva, and also Isabel, now adding your voice to that. We will continue this discussion, but I would like to turn our attention now to Jennifer Martin, who is going to present another paper to us, The Legacy of Slavery, and I think we need to add this voice really here to this discussion. Let me introduce Jennifer Martin to you. As I said earlier, she is a co-moderator also of the reference group of the Pilgrimage of Justice and Peace within the World Council of Churches. And it has been great to work with Jennifer all the way through. She's a member of the United Church in Jamaica and the Cayman Islands. She's the Education in Mission Secretary of the Caribbean and North America Council for Mission. Jennifer Martin is also a member of the executive group of the World Council of Churches Commission on World Mission and Evangelism. Jennifer, there's so much more to say about you, but let's leave it like that. I don't want to steal your time. Please go ahead. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Fernando. If you stole my time, somebody would give it back to me, I know.
I'm
Good
sure.
morning, friends. I'm really happy to join this conversation. I'm happy on a number of fronts. The first I would think is that from as long as I can remember, I have been aware of color and racism. I grew up in Jamaica. I was born here, and thank God my eyes have always worked and my senses have worked generally. So it would be impossible not to have noticed. So I do not enter this conversation in any neutral manner. For a long time I've had, I wouldn't say fixed, but certainly considered opinions on the matter. I mean, first of all, people are the legacies of slavery. But before I go into these prepared remarks, I'm going to ask Marcelo to share some images with us. First one, please, Marcelo. Now, that first image, and I trust everybody is seeing it well. It speaks about Columbus's voyages to the Americas, 1492 till 1504. The movement and the movement of ships in the Caribbean is a very important image here. Please move to the next one. It's important to remember those ships, the ships that he had, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. And those ships are described in a poem, which I might introduce to you at the end if there is time, as Columbus's doom-burdened caravels, because those innocuous looking ships really brought doom to this part of the world. Next one, please. This one I present to you because they say a picture can tell 1,000 words, many words. This image is very, very significant because for as long as the British have colonized and sought to colonize and to dehumanize and to enslave persons, for as long as that has gone on, there has been objection and protest and wars and fighting because people in this side of the world have never taken quietly to the matter of oppression. Next one, please. This image, the title says cane cutters, and I wanted to share with you an image of persons who were not enslaved. These were persons who were cane cutters. They came as indentured workers. After the ending of the time of enslavement here, labor became somewhat scarce and unwilling. And so the English people sent abroad and hired Indian people and Chinese people to work. Please, next one. This picture is quite a significant one. So I've raced through the years because time is not our friend. So after centuries of being ruled outright by Britain, a government came into place which still had and still has the Queen as the head, Queen of England as the head of state. This picture shows the sister of the Queen who came to represent her. And she's dancing with the first Premier of Jamaica, Sir Alexander Bustamante. By serendipity, perhaps, our first not Governor General, our first Premier was somebody who was of mixed race. It just happened. But another part of the narrative is the person who had started the political movement which led to Bustamante coming to the fore was somebody who was Black. What he thought and others thought that because of his complexion, the workers would listen more to somebody who had a different kind of complexion. And that is how Bustamante was introduced to politics. And he went on to becoming first Premier. Next one. And this is where the pictures stop. It's a very significant picture. As you know from life experiences, that tourism is a very, very, very significant and important industry in this part of the world. It's also quite brutal in its consequences when things like COVID come. So now the entire region is in the throes of figuring out how to deal with the fall off. And so again, at this time, we have a ship. So I'm now going to go to my notes. Thank you very much, Fernando. So the society in the Caribbean when I grew up was one in which the matter of color was very much alive. The matter of whiteness was alive and still remains alive because it could not be denied, even visually, looking at people in the Caribbean region and Jamaica in particular. It was not possible to pretend that people were not mixed and that the mixing of ethnic groups did not take place. But also what was important and remains important, even if less so at the moment, is that literally the color of a person's skin affected the person's life chances, economic life chances. And so color has always been significant. Now, despite the constraints brought on by slavery and that time of oppression, there were always people who found a way to learn to read and to become educated. That happened during slavery and it happened after. And after abolition, it came to notice, people knew that education was important. And this is one area of work in the Caribbean that we always recognize: the church. The church, despite all its complicity with slavery, there are persons in the church who always recognize that it was very important to work on educating the people. That education would lead, of course, to a replacement of Black people or people of mixed race of white people in the system. But it was important, and education played a very important role. The Mirror, Mirror is a book in which Rex Nettleford speaks of how people would really look at the society around them, look at themselves, and recognize that they would have to find their way in the world regardless of what they looked like. So that although ethnic privilege was a reality and could be seen, persons recognized that it was always necessary to fight through whatever barriers existed. So if you call to mind the maroon image that I shared with you, persons have recognized that it's important to use education as a weapon to go through. Also, in the 70s, 60s and 70s, the Black Power movement spoke to Jamaican and Caribbean people to say, we are whole human beings. Some parts of the church were saying we were made in the image of God. Some parts of the church were really supporting oppression in a strange kind of way. But the Black Power movement helped us to recognize that we need to find our place through education, through economic endeavor, and through speaking up for ourselves. And to recognize that your physical self is an important feature. It is a representation of who you are. And so Young, Gifted, and Black was a kind of music that helped to shape the 70s, when Black people could look in the mirror, could wear their hair natural, and recognize that although it is understood that whiteness is what is ruling the roost, so to say, Blackness was important too. And so color has continued to be a very important feature in the Caribbean. But you see, the importance of color didn't arise in the 70s or the 60s. It came from the time of Columbus. In preparing my paper, I was reminded again that from the time Columbus came to Jamaica, on record in his own diary, which was found and printed and so on, he commented on the color of the people. So color is there all the time in the background. It is there in the foreground, in that although white people form a teeny tiny minority in this part of the world, I have to say with my colleague Tiniko, that if the numbers are small, there is no guarantee that the persons who form the majority will be in power, even if they are in political power. Norman Gervin gives us a number of descriptions of the Caribbean. And I choose one. I can't read all because we don't have time, and you can see them in the paper itself. But Gervin, among other things, describes the Caribbean as an ethno-historic zone. And this is particular when talking about whiteness as a legacy of slavery. Caribbean peoples have had similar, but not necessarily the same experience based upon the very fact of slavery. And it is not surprising that whiteness remains a signifier. So we had the abolition, we have had independence, we have had Black prime ministers, we have had a Black woman prime minister. But in the background, in the foreground, in the economy of the place, it is always very clear that whiteness is very much alive. The geographic and linguistic spread of the Caribbean makes it difficult to speak of a common Caribbean person. So we move on by talking about what is whiteness. Well, I've heard a very good example of explanation of whiteness since morning, but I will add a few things to say that whiteness and white racialized identity refer to the ways in which white people, their customs, culture, and beliefs operate as the standard by which all other groups are compared. So it is a pillar of modern society that whiteness sets the tone and everything else works around it. And then if we move away from whiteness and we think of color, I give one small personal example. When our daughter was doing her PhD, she did some of her research in the Dominican Republic. And when she went looking like her mother with low cut hair, she received one kind of response and treatment. And when she creamed, she has a big head of hair. When she creamed her hair and it looked like a white person's hair and her complexion is what it is, she got a different kind of treatment. So we know in the Caribbean, therefore, that whiteness seems to be the main pillar and everything else works around it. And so we are saying here from the sociology of race that like water to the proverbial fish, whiteness has been largely invisible in the modern world. It is a European creation. While whiteness partakes of normality and transparency, it is also dominant, insistently so. It is taken for granted that whiteness is the norm and it is the dominant way in which the society operates. Because of my time, I will try and quickly go on to the separate points which I would like to make. I move on and raise as my first point what I describe as the intractable presence of whiteness. By intractable, I mean something that is stubborn and will not move. So when I was listening to Ivor's paper, I was thinking, how will we explain? And I'm not looking down, I'm just using some words here. How do we explain to ourselves and to persons who are seriously saying the white system must go? How do we explain that it is intractable and stubborn and it knows how to sustain itself? I put that as a question. Colonial slavery shaped modern Britain and all its former territories. So the Commonwealth that we know now is a survivor of the old British Empire. And so it is still headed by the Queen of England. We find in Jamaica and in the Caribbean, and the discussion is going on, that it is a very curious thing that the head of state of the country in which I live resides in another country, her own country. But to get to go to that country, I have to get a visitor's visa. When the visa is issued, we are told that when you get to the port of entry, there will be no guarantee that you are given admission. It is part of one of the examples that I hold up as an intractable situation, that although we think things have changed, they have not changed quite as much as we would have thought. The meaning of whiteness in Jamaica was established from the time of Columbus. When Columbus came, this is what he wrote. Some of them paint themselves black, And they are the color of the Canary Islanders. They're neither black nor white. They ought to be good servants and of good skill, for I see that they repeat very quickly all that is said to them, and I believe that they would be easily made into Christians, because it seemed that they belonged to no religion. Now, how could he have drawn that conclusion? Of course, I have no idea, but that's a conclusion he drew, and it remained, and to a certain extent has remained. Columbus did not discover the land, but it is instructive that he really set out to stratify the inhabitants in terms of their usefulness as servants and to their future openness to being shaped as Christians. Columbus and his generation, so to say, decided about the kinds of rules that people who look like the Arawak and Taino Indians would place. And to this day, the major role of persons in this country, the broad working class people, and most of the persons here are in the service industry. So it is not ironic at all. It is predictable that the difficulties being experienced by the tourist industry would so badly affect persons who are in the service industry. So Columbus started like that, and successful generations have kept going in various ways the fact of whiteness being superior. I move quickly to my second point, which I call out of many one people, and it has to do with the independence of this part of the world, nations becoming independent. I raise that because it is very important to bear in mind that when Jamaica gained freedom through abolition, and indeed other nations this way too, the colonizers at the time felt that this part of the world, and Jamaica in particular, was not ready for freedom. But in books I have read, it says that part of the reason it was not thought that these African persons were ready for freedom was that they might protest too much, they might fight too much, and they might ruin the economy of the country. So that was an important point. At the time of independence, it was also felt that Jamaican people would not be ready for freedom. And that is to do with how we are seen and how it is that racism works. I want to pull us quickly forward to 2010, and I want to read a quotation to you, which I find to be quite signal. It says, Jamaica's 2010 report to the UN's International Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination makes a statement which challenges us to consider the impact of skin color in the land of one people. This is a statement. Racism does not manifest itself as it does in other countries. The greater challenge for Jamaica is overcoming the residual impact of slavery on the society. Is skin color is sometimes approximated with opportunities for upward social mobility. So even in an official document going to the UN in 2010, it was found necessary and remains so to raise up the fact that skin color is sometimes approximated with opportunities for upward social mobility. So it opens up the society to an invitation to whiteness. Therefore, we have a high level of people bleaching their skin to get it a different, lighter color. And we have high incidence of people wearing weaves and artificial hair to make themselves look different. I'm conscious that my time is almost done, Fernando. Okay, give me 1 minute more and I'll be done. The last point I want to make, it's about being unsettled. The region is a region that feels unsettled. I know the whole world is unsettled. I know there are movements of people in all parts of the world. But what's different, I think, about the Caribbean is that we have far more nationals outside of our borders than we do. And it is not that we do not love the region. It is a push and pull of economic factors that continues to draw people out. And so we started with the ship of Columbus. We have come through the ship of Marcus Garvey and other ships, and we are now looking at cruise lines, wondering how to regain entrance. And those cruise liners in closing do not belong to the Caribbean. They're international. And most of the owners do not look like me. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jennifer, helping us to go even deeper into the complexity of it, and especially from the context of Jamaica. It is, I think, Jamaica for me is one of the places that where you can feel the most and learn the most about this complexity. It is a wonderful place, but it's also a very painful place with, yeah, great people. I mean, that's the greatest gift that I've found there. Iva, you are invited to respond, and we have to keep the time. So keep it concise if you can, so that we can add 2-3 more voices to your response. Iva, go ahead, please.
Thank you. Thank you, my beloved sister Jennifer. I
Thank you.
think you have masterfully used Rex Nettleford's Mirror, Mirror as a way to capture the intersectionality of internal and external consequences of global whiteness. You have provided us with a historical understanding of the ways in which identity formation for people of African descent, though a majority in Jamaica, and non-African ethnic minorities have been impacted, internalizing a hierarchy of human value that is grounded in colorism, class, and race. You're introducing us to some of the journal of Columbus is very instructive. I am especially, though, pleased by the way in which you have intersected the use of the arts as a way to tell a people's narrative and story. And Bob Marley and the Wailers' redemption song that you lifted up remains very timely, as the major religion in Jamaica is Christianity and some of it conservative. What you have said is that the music penetrates all of that to tell a different story of resistance to whiteness. You've already alluded to the consequences of the transatlantic slave trade in terms of this residual colorism that people are now appropriating, and it becomes a system that is related to color. And you have allowed us to dig a little deeper into understanding that the Caribbean is not a monolithic space. I think that in the contemporary context of you, as you have just said, you call us to acknowledge and interrupt the normative standards of whiteness, recognizing that none of us can escape the impact of whiteness. And there must be a different answer to an old question. And so, as my old colleague Rex Nettleford talked about in terms of Mirror, Mirror, there's another question, Mirror, Mirror on the wall, who's the fairest of them all, is really one of the takeaways of what you have shared with us. So much complexity abounds in this conversation, and the role of the church is to plant, to nurture, and sow seeds of nonconformity to the exegesis of empire. Having said that, again, I marvel at the way in which you have juxtaposed the ships. The ships are coming. The ships are coming. Columbus's ship, the cruise ship line, which represents the intractability of the potentiality that the Caribbean nation states will always serve a servant industry. But you also juxtaposed that and called up the vision of Marcus Garvey's Black Star liner as another kind of ship, a kind of ship that represents the reckoning, the potential for reparatory justice, for reparations, for reconciliation, for redemption, for renewal. And that is the hopeful sign. No doubt, we throughout the diaspora are inspired by the role of CARICOM in terms of the reparations work that you are doing. And that work in part being for sure driven by a faith and a belief in the power of a God. I think at the end of the day, this forum and certainly this conversation would leave us to ask ourselves, is it possible that whiteness itself is a God, and that is covered by a fake religiosity of Christian gospel and democracy? And that is what indeed is causing for a shift in how we understand hegemony and empire. So I'm going to get on your boat and ship. I'm going to think more deeply about what it means, as you have talked about settledness. And I suggest 3 points of embarkation. One is the interrogation of what it means to have settledness in the existential space of a global virtual world. What does it mean to find home in a virtual world? Number two, the epigenetics of unintended consequences of language in white supremacy. One of our dearest, newest ancestors, a psychiatrist, Patricia Newton, used to talk about as a psychiatrist, knowing the science of epigenetics, is that we should not even use the concept of white supremacy because it reinforces that very construct. And then thirdly, I would ask us to think about, as we embark on the painful yet real internalized self-negation that you talked about, that is a derivative of transgenerational views of beauty and colorism. That is, how do we interrupt that process whereby, because whether you're in a majority or a minority situation, the reality is we have all internalized and been impacted by this thing called whiteness, whether in Brazil, South Africa, the Caribbean, or the United States. So I thank you for your reflection and the opportunity to respond.
I thank you.
Thank you, Iva. Thanks again. Let me quickly make a remark to our audience here worldwide. You have heard us referring time and again to papers and responses. Here's the good news. All that you have heard so far, and you will hear during the next sessions of our webinars, the papers will be published in a special edition of the International Review of Missions. So that will come up soon. So if you are interested to read in detail and to give you more time to digest really all the reflections that we hear here, that will be possible. So all of this will be published. Jennifer, we have 5 more minutes. Now I allow you to decide, please, to how long you want to respond to Iva's response, or do you want to listen to more voices? That's a difficult.
I would take 30 seconds.
Go ahead.
To thank you, Fernando. To really thank you, Iva, for having read the paper and made such a valuable contribution to me. And I will look to see how to incorporate more points. One point of challenge that you give to me that I will hold on to is, how do we deal with the matter of unsettledness in a world that is really not settled? And how to work against holding on to the concept of the words white supremacy. So thanks for all that you have said, but those in particular. Fernando, to others, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you. Sorry to
No, time. Go ahead.
Sione, Professor Javea from the Pacific, you have made some comments in the chat. Others have as well. Very, very interesting comments. Sione, can I invite you to speak? This is also connecting again with the previous discussion that we had. Go ahead.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Iva.
Thank you.
My question is, well, we all want this thing to fall, whiteness to fall. But what is holding whiteness up? So it's clear that the economy is holding whiteness up. Power is holding it up. Gender is holding it up. And when you show that image of Columbus' fleet with the cross on the sail, isn't Christianity also holding whiteness up? And how do we let whiteness fall without us as Christians letting Christianity fall first? Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks. Thanks a lot. Magali Cunha, Professor Cunha from Brazil. Your contribution, I believe, is going into the same direction, speaking from Brazil. Go ahead.
Yes, this understanding of whiteness, we were commenting in the chat that it changes according to the context. And when we talk about whiteness in a colonial context, a context of a country, a place, a group, a society that has been colonized, we have to look at this idea of a land that is connected, economy, patriarchy, and racism is all connected. And so I think what Jennifer has shared leads us to a need of deepening these conceptions according to the context where we are.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Magali. I think, I mean, we see the intersectionality, of course, which is not new, but it's always good to be reminded of the complexity in order to deconstruct. I mean, this is the only way to deconstruct really this whiteness, at least to a certain degree. For the ecumenical fellowship, of course, it is most striking that also Christianity, or that churches, let's say, are upholding it. And Peter, you had a comment also on that. I mean, I do believe that we need to speak about that more and discuss it more and do a self-critical analysis also of the ecumenical movement. How much are we contributing to upholding a system that is actually dehumanizing so many of us? Peter, keep it short, and then we have to close.
So yes, I think the piece I felt very helped with by both Iva and Jennifer then is this global notion of whiteness that's being held up. Because I think, responding to Sione, in Europe, Christianity and whiteness are becoming separated, and whiteness is not falling. So there is some fascinating work, and maybe in these disconnected places in Europe for white people, there's vital work to do to interrogate this and how to take this as a fresh opportunity to take a critical nature to whiteness. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, we need more sessions like this, and we will have more sessions like this, continuing again with the brilliant speakers that we had today. Jennifer Martin, thanks a lot for your paper. Very helpful, and I hope that we will continue tomorrow and the next days with you also to discuss the matter at stake. Iva Karutis, thanks so much for leading us into this discussion, really, opening the field for us to see with new eyes, and but not to forget the hope. We thank you for those encouraging words from your mouth. That means a lot, I would say, speaking for myself here. At times when we analyze with the sharp mind of Professor Manoleke, then sometimes I wonder, is there an end to this, or will this injustice always keep itself up and be the winner? But then when I listen to Iva, and to Isabel and others, then hope comes back, and also I think the calling of the ecumenical movement to create spaces like this, at least where we start to deconstruct some of the powers that keep on dehumanizing so many of us. It has been a wonderful time, a gift to be with you all. Thanks for joining. Let's close this session with a short moment of silent prayer. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God. It is the peace with justice that we are seeking, that we are fighting for, that we are hoping for, that we are longing for, God. And we know that without your empowerment, we will not see it. Thank you for this space. Thank you for these people. Thank you for this fellowship. This is what provides hope by the power of your Holy Spirit. Amen.
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 Friends, go in peace.
Thank you.
See you soon for the next session.
Thank you.
The next session will be tomorrow. The topic will be religion, white superiority, and Aboriginal peoples. Yet another aspect to add to the complexity. Hope to see you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.